Hello, everyone. Today, I would like to speak about the Pope, Pope Francis, who left us recently, and the process of succession that is now taking place. They will be selecting a new Pope on May 7, apparently. So, this is an opportunity for us to learn astrology, learn different techniques. I'm going to speak about the Dwads and about the death chart and about transits as an exploration of the new candidates for the role. Now, Pope Francis was an important figure, not only in the Catholic world, but I believe for many people. Just like the Dalai Lama, you don't need to be a Buddhist to resonate or to share values of compassion. We know there were a lot of controversies with the Catholic Church. And this is something I'd like to use astrology for to understand better. So let's begin with his natal chart. He was born right after a solar eclipse. How we know that? The sun is on the nodes, so it's around eclipse season, but the moon is not there. You need both the sun and the moon on the nodes. The moon is in Aquarius. So he was born about a week, less than a week after an eclipse. And pay attention to this moon. It's a moon in Aquarius. It's conjunct Venus, and it squares Uranus. The reason is that there are patterns here astrologically that can be very important. So he has a very classic Pope chart. How so? The sun in Sagittarius has to do with philosophy, theology, belief system. The fact that the sun is on the North Node shows leadership. So he's going to be a leader either in academic circles and fields or in religious institutions. Jupiter is there as well to really give more authority with Jupiter being in Capricorn. So he's entering, he was um, stepping into a very conservative institution, which is very typical to Jupiter in Capricorn. So the fact that his south node is in Gemini speaks about the cross-cultural aspect of the papacy for him, given that he was the first, I believe, Southern Hemisphere Pope to be selected. Certainly, first one from the Americas. So that Gemini flavor captures the ability to, walk on different bridges, build different bridges. And it adds to his more cosmopolitan, interfaith, uh, modern understanding of the world. The South Node, represents our assets, what we're coming with. And given that it's in the 12th house in Gemini, it's definitely someone who feels at home everywhere with everyone. Now, we see obviously the strong leadership with the sun on the nodes in Sagittarius, but the strong religious connection is certainly Saturn being in Pisces and opposing its ruler, Neptune. And that is where we see his devotion and his uh, vows of modesty, service. Saturn has everything to do with law, order, with institution, with structure, with authority figures, and with what we can rely on, whether it's a person or it's a building or, it's the firm ground that we stand on. It is whatever stands the test of time. When Saturn is in Pisces, what stands the test of time is not in the material world. It's in the spiritual world. This is why many people born with Saturn in Pisces and Saturn-Neptune aspects can feel through different phases of their lives that they lack this solidity, that they don't have firm ground to stand on. Maybe parents were absent. Maybe there was no authority figures that they could rely on or trust. So it's a sense of being a little bit lost, uh, not being able to hold a job, addiction problems, feelings that nothing is stable in your life. There's a risk of neglect, parental neglect, authority neglect, governance neglect, recklessness. And so it puts leader in a position where they can't fully perform in their current ways unless there's a spiritual quality that is incorporated. So he becomes a spiritual role model, and then that Saturn in Pisces can become solid because you speak with authority on matters that are not about practical management, but about humanity, um, rights and wrong that go beyond, again, physical, material, practical references, but rights and wrong that are rooted in divinity, in higher spiritual truths. Now, we are now at a time of Saturn, Neptune, and it's in Pisces. So it's kind of a double signature where Saturn is in Pisces and it's conjunct on the North Node, the ruler of Pisces. For the Pope, it is, we may say, a recurrence. That's what word that I want to use. And when I teach about transits, that is how to really identify transits. How do you know if a transit's going to be, very meaningful for you? One of the reasons is that it's a recurrence. If you're born with a Saturn-Neptune aspect, anyone, a conjunction, an opposition, something tight, every time there's a Saturn-Neptune conjunction or aspect, you will feel it, even if it doesn't touch a specific degree. The fact that there's a recurrence means that you are responding to this cycle. And so for the Pope, it is a signature that represents a milestone. He went through his Saturn return, which is a milestone, third one, but it's also a Saturn-Neptune recurrence. So the fact that his soul chose this exit is very meaningful. So I'm going to talk about the death chart soon. Just another note on the natal chart. He is born with Mars in Libra, and it's what we call an airy Mars. So many popes have Mars in Libra, and it's a good thing for them. Because if you want to be a celibate, air signs and I mean Mars and Venus in air signs can perhaps be the best candidates for that. I'm not saying that every person with Mars, Venus in air signs are going to be celibate, but they tend to be in the upper worlds rather than in the lower chakras. So someone with a Mars, Venus in air sign can be very social, but they're not necessarily sexual. Their libido may be more tamed naturally. So it's not a coincidence that John Paul II also had Mars in Libra. And, I don't remember now other charts, but these two come to mind. And Venus in Aquarius is also a very intellectual approach to sexuality. And that's one of the virtues of the Pope, Francis, is that he was, relatively speaking, more open-minded with regards to minorities and LGBTQ and interfaith cooperation. Many things that, were a little bit stuck as far as the Catholic Church was concerned. And so he revived some of that, which, again, from an Aquarius, Venus, Moon in Aquarius point of view, two points that we can make. One of them is that he was more modern, more contemporary, where Jupiter in Capricorn is very conservative and he's going to look at the ancestral ways and traditions. The Moon Venus in Aquarius is more open to what's going on in the current times. We may say it's about being more in touch with the younger generations. So many people say he didn't do enough. And yeah, it's debatable. I think that if he had pushed the envelope more, they would probably have eliminated him. It would not fly because, look who you're talking to. It's one of the most conservative institutions. And so he took many risks, personal risks, in even going, in the direction that he went. That's personal opinion. Now, if we look at the time he was initiated as a pope, he was selected as a pope. The chart for that time is quite descriptive of some of the challenges he faced and some of the things he wanted to advance. So one of the things we see is that he was, again, nominated with a Moon-Uranus conjunction, that same signature that he has at birth. Moon-Uranus seemed to be recurrent, Moon Aquarius, Moon-Uranus, which obviously makes us understand that Uranus, is a modern ruler of Aquarius. Another kind of representation of that. And what we also see is that Saturn is on the North Node in the sign of Scorpio. Now that is critical. Saturn on the North Node has to do with accountability. It has to do with the need to discern right from wrong. So there's some kind of karmic debt with Saturn on the nodes, whether it's South Node or North Node or square the nodes. But on the North Node is even more pressing, and it's in the sign of Scorpio, which has to do with sexuality and trust in general, trust of authority, Saturn, and then financial management. So we know that in the course of his tenure as a pope, more sexual scandals involving the clergy and the church were exposed. And for the first time, there was some kind of accountability and responsibility, apology being expressed and taken. And in a way, that is extremely important, given that this is the signature of his inauguration. So it is something that he was meant and called to do, to be the voice of those who were silenced, of those who were sexually abused. But on a deeper level, it's about obviously, you know, stopping the abuse. It's about prosecuting Saturn, the offenders, and bringing justice to what happened. But on a deeper level, it's also about better understanding the role of sexuality, in the church and outside the church. So it's kind of a revision of the moral codes and to assess whether celibacy is sustainable. Now, I've done some work on understanding the spiritual times that we're in, and especially as we are now very thick, in the thick of the Pisces age, at the tail end of it, actually. And we see that there has been a separation of spirit from flesh, and how damaging that has been. So, as we look at the abuse, yes, prosecute, the offenders, yes, compensate the victims and apologize, but how can we prevent that from happening again? Right? Should we reconcile? Should we look into the deeper meanings, of a spiritual life? So I'll leave it to that, but look at the symbolism. What is Saturn in Scorpio on the North Node trying to tell us on those different layers? And so he, he is also inaugurated with a Saturn trine Neptune this time. Neptune is in Pisces. Um, the Sun is in Pisces. Venus is in Pisces. So there's a lot of that, a representative of something much larger than himself, both on a collective level, but also on a spiritual level, representing a whole movement and a whole institution, but also representing, being a messenger of the divine, so to speak. Now, I want to look into the death chart. What is the death chart? Just like we analyze the birth chart, we look at the time of passing as a new milestone for the soul. Keep in mind, we're working with evolutionary astrology, and evolutionary astrology is about identifying the soul journey. So the soul continues from life to life. And the death chart is a new birth chart to the next dimension. How long is he going to spend in between incarnations? Um, Left to know. But what really matters is that the death chart, like the birth chart, represents where we're coming from, where we're at, and what are the next steps. And so that chart can tell us where is Pope Francis at? And what did he accomplish in his life? And where is the soul intending to continue? So the death chart is extremely important because it captures everything we did or did not do. It tells us where the soul is at. So there's no faking it. You know, whatever is resolved or unresolved or whoever you are is captured in the death chart. We cannot plan our death chart, right? We cannot do it ahead of time. So only those who stay behind are able to analyze it. Um, However, it is meaningful for those who are still incarnated because it tells us that if the death chart does show what we did or did not do in this life, it means that what we do matters. What we go through is registered, and that we take it with us to the next stage. So it brings a different perspective on how meaningful our actions, our words are. It hopefully inspires us to live better lives. I think, I put a lot of thought and research into the death chart because of that, because it is a testament to how our lives, our actions are not random, and that our soul, you know, is remembering, capturing everything that's being done. Now, looking at the death chart, as we said, he passed with Saturn again on the North Node, the same signature of his inauguration. That Saturn now is in Pisces, which is the sign of his birth. Now, that Saturn conjuncts Venus in Pisces. Ceres in Pisces. And Venus has to do with both the Taurian side of things, value, money, flesh, senses, pleasures. So, how do you find pleasure with Venus in Pisces? You find pleasure in spirit, not necessarily in physical gratification. So Venus in Pisces is a marriage to spirit. So there is something transcendental about Venus in Pisces. That doesn't mean everyone born with Venus in Pisces is going to be a pope or a celibate, but they may struggle with how to have fun down here, and they may struggle with integration of spirit and flesh. So we see again in that death chart that he passes with this signature that represents his vows of celibacy, but also his vows of poverty. As the leader of the extremely wealthy Catholic Church, I went to the Vatican a few months ago, and it's gold, gold, gold everywhere. It is so glamorous, um, shiny, uh, definitely a different idea than what Jesus had in mind. But the Pope Francis chose a more modest um, way of living, and he didn't live in the main palaces. He chose a more modest home. And so his life was devoted to service. Now, if we look at the chart, say, I mean, did he fake it? Was he actually pretending, to be compassionate and to help the poor? When we look at the death chart, you cannot fake that. So the fact that his Venus is in Pisces, this kind of marriage to spirit, and transcending material attachment to embrace, the true value, Venus, and the true value is compassion, is humanity. Now, that Venus is also conjunct Saturn, which is the role model. It's it's the governance, but it is also that austerity, that control. So not only is that Venus immaterial, it is also conjunct Saturn in Pisces that really brings a commitment to control, to restrain, to not give in to temptation. Now, it happens to be that Venus is also the ruler of the ascendant of his passing. He passed on a Taurus rising, which has to do with self-sufficiency, self-management, and wealth and sensuality. But that Venus being the ruler conjunct in Pisces in the 11th house, conjunct Saturn, shows that need to bring the material to a more transcendental, spiritual expression. We basically see he did not fake it. He was someone who believed in that simplicity and austerity, perhaps to a point of, I will say, risking um, some form of martyrdom. The risk of Pisces is martyrdom. Now, overall, I he, we see that he led a public life. The sun, that has to do with his purpose, is also in Taurus, but it's in the 12th house again, which is the house of collectivity. It's the house of, what I give back to the whole. It is a collective place. So there are so many repeating signatures of the need to associate the personal with the transpersonal. And so that, shows us how the death chart, reflects our lives, reflects where he is at. And then it's in the 11th house, that Venus Saturn is in the 11th house, which is again that Aquarian house of community, clergy, the group that he belonged to. And a moon in Aquarius. So not only a Saturn return, but a lunar return for his passing, recapturing his open-mindedness and his desire to bring humanity, modernity, younger generations to the church. Now that moon is very strategically placed, and it conjuncts Pluto. It opposes Mars in Leo. Now, the Pope suffered from failing health, mostly lungs, but eventually he died of a heart attack or a stroke. That is Mars in Leo. Mars is attack, Leo is the heart, and in opposing Aquarius, Aquarius has to do with brain function. So a stroke, heart, connection, Aquarius, Leo. The fact that it's angular on the IC-MC, shows how strategic that is in this kind of exit moment. Mars is a rupture. But what does that mean for his soul journey? That Mars, Moon, Pluto shows a battle of sorts. Shows a battle, first of all, between personal fourth house Mars and position, authority, responsibility, the public role and the personal role. It also shows, his battle to bring change. And that is recaptured by Uranus, the planet Uranus, on his death chart ascendant. So again, it's a return because he's born with Uranus in Taurus, earlier degrees, and he passes with Uranus in Taurus on an angle. And that Uranus, represents the need for reforms, for more, a more modern approach, for changes, modernizing the church and the struggles therein. And that takes us into the succession, right? Why, who's going to follow? Is the pendulum going to swing back to someone who's going to hold very conservative views and backpedal all that Francis tried to achieve? Or will there be, support for his values? Now, that Mars-Moon opposition also shows friction in his own family. His own family, in this case, is the clergy. So we see with this Mars, Pluto, and Moon that there were power struggles, which we probably, are not aware of right here, but they are, it shows division in his agenda. What is also really, I think, important is that the moon represents women. And the fact that the moon is really on top of the chart, conjunct Pluto, can also show, that part of his intention as he moves on to the next milestone, to the next life, to the next, chapter of his journey, that there's going to be an effort to advance women's causes in the spiritual development, and not just focus on diversity and open-mindedness, but gender equality. So that moon in Aquarius on Pluto, to me, brings the Mary Magdalene and the Marys everywhere as important leading figures, holy figures, both in heaven and on earth. So we bring, a lot of feminine energy with both the Venus emphasis and the moon emphasis. So Venus rules the ascendant, the moon is on the MC. What are we changing here? The fact that Neptune is on that inception degree, 0 Aries, which is the very beginning, of the zodiac, it's a new birth, also shows that there is an intention for a completely new paradigm in the spiritual um, domain. And if we look at the fact that it rules the North Node, it's on the North Node, there's really a need here to not return to old ways, but to continue paving the way for what rings true. It's not just about, oh, we want to preserve the order or change the order. What works? What is really, the message of Christ in a more universal way? It is a message of love. It is a message of tolerance, but it is also a message of what makes us true human beings. And so that Neptune in Aries is about spearheading what needs to be in the new order, in this new chapter. Another questions that come to mind with this chart is, as we said, are we resolving some of the sexual abuse issues? I suspect that part of this Mars-Pluto opposition on the nodes, is what remains unresolved as far as really reforming the way the church operates to prevent future abuse. So the accountability is more present, but is it also preventing future crisis? Saturn remains on the North Node. And when Saturn is on the North Node, think about it as it's a judgment day. You are watched. There is a higher presence that, brings karmic repercussions if you're not on your best behavior, so to speak. So it is putting pressure on doing the right thing, Saturn. Now, one other interesting thing I would like to insert into this analysis, I'm using a technique called the Dwad. It's a very old technique. It's used both in Vedic astrology and Western astrology. And what it does is basically look at the degrees of each planet and gives that degree another frequency. This is based on fractal rules of physics, that what exists on a larger scale also repeats itself on a smaller scale, and then a smaller scale. So each unit represents the whole. What do I mean by that? We have 12 signs through 360 degrees, which means that each sign is 30 degrees. The Dwad are a division of those 30 degrees in a sign into 12 signs, as if each sign contains the 12 signs. And so if you divide 30 degrees into 12, it's 2.5 degrees. So each 2.5 degree is a sub-sign. How does that work? So if we look at Pope Francis's chart, basically the first 2.5 degree of a sign are going to be a repetition of the same sign. Then from 2.5 to 5 degrees is going to be the next sign. So in his case, let's say we look at his natal chart and he's 10 degrees Cancer rising. So Cancer degrees From 0 to 2.5 is Cancer on Cancer. From 2.5 to 5 is going to be Cancer on Leo. From 5 to 7.5, it's going to be Cancer on Virgo. From 7.5 to 10, it's going to be Cancer on Libra. And then from 10 to 12.5 is going to be Cancer on Scorpio. So these sub signs are a subtle, a more subtle layer that gives another flavor to the degrees and placements of planets and ascendants. So in a way, we may say that his 10-degree ascendant is a Scorpio Dwad. And that means that it is flavored by a Scorpio energy. And, I've worked with this technique for a while, and there's a whole workshop on it, because what ends up happening is that you're not just looking at the 2.5-degree range, but within that 2.5 degree, there's 0 to 30. And so what you can do is recreate a completely new chart that's called the Dwad chart that represents the actual degrees of the Dwads in a new chart. And believe it or not, it's powerful, it's meaningful. And why do I bring it up here? First of all, to make you think about it. And second, to look at this incredible synchronicity. So Pope Francis, when he was inaugurated, chose the name Francis after the saint, St. Francis of Assisi, who was himself, someone who committed to the vows of poverty and celibacy and, his incentive to rebuild a new church. And of course, a lover of nature and a lover of animals and kind of this universal soul. And when we use the Dwad, we see that the sun of Francis at 2554 degrees Sagittarius, if you go through the same method, ends up a Libra Dwad. Not only is it a Libra Dwad, but it ends up 10 degrees Libra, and the computer can calculate for you exactly what degree of the Dwad. And 10 degrees of Libra is the son of St. Francis, who was born on a 10-degree Libra sun. What are the odds? So I think this is very interesting. So when we look at his Dwad chart, another fascinating thing is that he ends up with that Scorpio rising, 0 Scorpio, because it's how it's calculated. His sun is at 10 degrees Libra, opposing Neptune in Aries. And you know whose chart that looks like? The chart of Mohandas Gandhi, who is born with a sun at 10 degrees Libra, 8 degrees Libra, opposing Neptune in Aries. For what it's worth. So, if we look at the chart of St. Francis, this chart was calculated and researched and rectified by late astrologer Noel Till, who had a book on kind of these mythical figures and trying to recover their chart. And so from what I've seen, It's a very, very relevant chart. It's likely exact. I don't know if the time of birth is going to be exact, but the chart itself works like a clock. And we see, if you know a little bit of the story of St. Francis, he was born into a very wealthy family of merchants. And he enjoyed the good life of a privileged child, with this moon in Taurus in, conjunct Jupiter and Uranus. So very much opulent and comfortable. And then he went to war, Mars in Capricorn on the South Node, and was captured. And in his imprisonment is when he had his epiphanies, his spiritual awakening. And basically saw the grief, saw the trauma of war, and it shook him to eventually uh, go through this transformation where he abandoned wealth and comfort to a life of austerity, a life of simplicity, and a life of poverty. So that moon, Jupiter in Taurus, square Neptune, which is the vows of renunciation, of relinquishing, of letting go of the wealth. And then to rebuild a temple. So that moon Jupiter in Taurus wasn't just about the material abundance. It was about bringing a physical form to spirit. So building a church, a temple, is very much that moon Jupiter higher spiritual expression of St. Francis. And so Pope Francis had, like we said, these parallels using the Dwad technique. And this is cherry picking, it's just one example, but I'll show you another example and you'll be the judge. Now, as we cover all this and we move into, the grief of having someone who was a humanitarian, who seemed to care about people, and we may debate whether he was perfect or not. At least he did what he could and went for it. So the grieving of the passing of someone who was a light in this world also gives us insight and contemplation and perhaps anxiety about who will carry the torch. Will this be someone who continues his ways or kind of backpedals? And from what I understand, there are 70 plus candidates who can be voted on. So I did not look at the chart of 70 candidates, but I look at the chart of who appeared to be the leading ones. Now, and so from all the figures that I've looked, one of the things when we look at Pope Francis's inauguration and then his passing, in both times, Jupiter is in Gemini. And Jupiter in Gemini is a powerful Jupiter about ethnic diversity. And so it is more conducive to once again elect a pope who is not a white man from Central Europe or Western Europe, it leans towards other nation, other ethnic groups. Obviously, Catholics. You're not going to elect a Buddhist for the role of Pope. Who I came up as one of the main leading candidate astrologically was Luis Antonio Go Kim Tagle from the Philippines. And the reason is, from an astrological point of view, there are several conditions to examine. So if we rely on the May 7 date for selection, the sun on that day will be on his nodes, which is a signature for prominence and for recognition and leadership. So that's number one. Number two, he's born on the solstice, 21st of June. Now, we don't know the time of birth, so it could be, it's between 29 Gemini. His sun is 29 Gemini to 0 Cancer. And that is an extremely important degree because all the planets now are, not all, but many planets are on that 29 0 degrees, 29 mutable 0 degrees cardinal. Cardinal for cardinals. So Saturn is going to be at that 29 degrees. Neptune is at 1 degrees Aries. Jupiter is late Gemini, is going to be on his sun and then move on that solstice 0 Cancer degree. So having someone whose sun is strategically placed on that passage and threshold means a lot and could elevate him in one way or another, but that's definitely one of the ways. Then on the actual day, May 7th, the moon will be in Virgo. It's on Pope Francis' own Neptune. And it's going to be conjunct the South Node on Louis's Jupiter. So Jupiter is very immediately related to religion and to clergy and to that institution. So having all these personal activations, moon on his Jupiter, square the transiting Jupiter, is very revealing and could again bring him to prominence. So maybe, it's a good chance. Now, I also looked at his Dwad chart and see what is being revealed there. So now the natal, the inner wheel is his natal Dwad. So once again, if his sun is 29 Gemini, his Dwad is going to be Taurus. Trust me. And that means that Uranus is going to be right on his sun. And then his Saturn Dwad, which is in the natal chart in Sagittarius, ends up being a Saturn in Pisces Dwad. Exactly on the North Node, exactly where the current Saturn is. So it's kind of a, it's not an actual Saturn return, but it's a Dwad Saturn activation. And obviously Saturn has everything to do with governance and with succession. The elder to the younger generation. And just like Pope Francis, he has a Saturn in Pisces opposing Neptune in Virgo. The same as the natal chart of Pope Francis. The Dwad of Jupiter, which is in Virgo natally, the Dwad is in Gemini on the North Node, activated by Jupiter. So it's a Jupiter return, it's a Saturn return, it's a Sun return. A lot going on that suggests he's going to be recognized. So once again, I didn't do all the charts, but I looked at the leading figures, and that's what showed up for him. I am going to look briefly at other candidate, and one of them is a French candidate called Jean-Marc Aveline from France, originally born in Algeria. And he is also favored as someone who was very close to Pope Francis and more open-minded. So he would also kind of continue what Pope Francis started, in his line of values. Now, interestingly, he's also a 28 degrees Saturn, immutable sign, conjunct a Sun in early cardinal. So he has that same kind of solstice presence, um, and that could elevate him. Now, natally, if you're born with the Sun in Capricorn conjunct Saturn, again, it's a leadership signature. It's very conservative. Saturn is in Sagittarius, the sign of religion. So no doubt he is a spiritual leader, a religious leader. But interestingly, this is something as a side note that I've kind of wrote about on my astrology group on Facebook, is that look at the next two charts. He has Mars in Taurus opposing Jupiter in Scorpio. Now, on the one hand, people with a Mars Jupiter are people with strong convictions, strong character, very confident, and strong points of view. But it's in the signs of Taurus and Scorpio. We talk about spirit and flesh. Mars in Taurus is extremely sensual. It's carnal. No, I spoke about Pope Francis having Mars in air signs, Venus in air sign, and being, more of the mind over senses. Now, during the inquiries and investigation about the sexual abuse of the church, he was singled out as someone who didn't do enough to prevent and didn't do enough to speak up. They say he was naive about it. Is it naive or more than that? I don't know. And another major candidate for the role is Cardinal Peter Erdo, who is born in Hungary. So, two European candidates. And he is also a cardinal son, born around the solstice. So we see that same important placement, a signature that is conducive to the current transits. Now, Jupiter is going to move into Cancer. Neptune and Saturn are going to move into Aries and possibly elevate that sun. Now, interestingly, as a Cancer Sun Venus, born on a Venus star point, one of his strong affiliation is to Mother Mary. So Cancer is the sign of the mother. How interesting that with the sun Venus in Cancer, he is more predominantly invested in the servitude and devotion to Mother Mary. He's also born during a Saturn-Neptune conjunction, so there's a recurrence. It's in the opposite sign. You know, the current one is going to be in Aries. He's born in the Libra conjunction in the early 50s. So that is also on his, to his advantage. But similar to Aveline, him too has a Mars-Jupiter opposition in Scorpio Taurus. Now here the Mars is in Scorpio. In Aveline, the Mars was in Taurus, so it's a reversed Mars-Jupiter opposition. So once again, this depicts a lot of strong convictions, but a lot of struggles between spirit and flesh. And once again, he is among those who were singled out as clergy members who looked the other way, who were not adamant enough in the pursuit of justice and in exposing, abusive priests. Keep in mind that these three candidates, Louis Tagle and Jean-Marc Aveline and Peter Erdo, we don't have their time of birth. So even though all of them are born with the sun close to a solstice point, and that is very strong for what's going on, and the May 7 transits, we have many blind spots. We don't have the full picture. So many blessings in this time, and of course, gratitude, blessings for the soul in his continued journey. May he, and I'm sure he will, send protection for us down here. And then may the next leading figure of this important institution serve humanity where it's at today and addresses modern challenges to bring wisdom, integrity, guidance for those who seek. So I hope this was an interesting learning experience for all of you, and that you're more curious about death charts and Dwads. You have a free video on the death chart, and you have a more extensive workshop if you really want to get into soul work. So until next time.